After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. Death and destruction have been features of this Trump administration. Over the last week, another death at the hands of ICE agents, the demise of an MOU with Iran that never really lived, and the human toll that will no doubt follow. The slow, painful death of NATO, and the death of Trump primary opponent turned sycophant, Senator Lindsey Graham. With us this week to discuss all of this death and outrage is After America favourite Allan Behm, Special Advisor in International Affairs here at the Australia Institute. I bet that's up there with one of the happier intros you've ever gotten, Allan.
Yeah, it's pretty close to it, Emma. I feel as though I'm at an undertaker's convention.
I think that it's going to be that kind of episode, unfortunately.
Right up my street, Emma.
Good. All right, well, let's get into it. We do, Allan, seem to be having the same conversation about Iran every time you're on this show over the last several months. That, as I mentioned, that MOU is finally dead. I don't think there's any other way to describe it.
To me, I think it's over. I don't want to deal with them anymore. They're scum.
It's open. We bombed the hell out of them last night. They're very, very evil and sick people.
And I'm not sure I want to make a deal with them. We can play games, but I'm not sure I want to make a deal. Let's just finish the job. Yeah, please.
Trump and Pete Hegseth are issuing threats, but they've been doing that so much that nobody's really paying any attention anymore. It's barely getting any coverage. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. American strikes are ongoing. Is this just what it is now for the foreseeable future?
Very hard to answer that question, Emma. What has happened there is that Trump has fallen into a strategic black hole. And he can't, and I think the United States can't escape it without a massive change, a real gear change in the way in which they approach the whole issue of the Middle East, including Iran. So not just about Iran, but the way in which they think about all of the moving parts of the Middle East, and there are many of them. And until they do that, they're locked into the old problem of what happens when, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so the only tool that appears to be at the disposal of the United States, and I mean the only strategic tool, seems to be armed force. And yet this whole problem is not conducive to an armed force solution. That's what Trump is proving to himself and to the world every day, every week. It's why the agreement collapsed. It's why we always go back to where we were, but when we get back there, it's worse than it was when we left it. And that's precisely the position in which the United States finds itself. Iran, interestingly, doesn't find itself in the same position because Iran knows how to turn massive disadvantage into strategic advantage. And that's what it's doing. It's opening and closing the Gulf of Hormuz. It really doesn't want to create a global collapse because it can think far enough into the future about where it might stand in 3, 5, 10 years' time. But equally, in the short term, it can blame Trump for every bit of discomfort that the world experiences, whether it's high energy prices or the lack of fertilizers. So the United States finds itself in a bind, which it has been in before. Vietnam ended in rather much the same sort of way, and the bind continued for another decade thereafter. Iraq is still going on as a bind. It's barely ended, and although the characters have all changed and there seems to be a kind of semi-stability in Iraq, underneath it's still boiling. There are still many enmities. Israel doesn't know whether it's Arthur or Martha. It doesn't know whether it's a friend of the United States or whether it's been discarded, nor does the United States for that matter. And Lebanon, I spent a couple of hours on Saturday morning, Emma, talking to a highly experienced and senior journalist who lives in Lebanon. And the Lebanese don't know where they are either, but particularly in the south around Beirut.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is one of these intractable problems. And what it might look like in 3 weeks or a month's time, nobody can even guess. And that's the problem.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant problem. And as you said there, Alan, this isn't, of course, just about Iran. It's about Lebanon, about Palestine, about the entire Middle East. And the strategic landscape is being reshaped by the United States and its inability to use any other tools but military force. The Gulf states in particular seem to be, I suppose, the leaders of the Gulf states seem to be realizing that the old game is finished, that those often unspoken agreements between Gulf states and Israel and Gulf states and the United States are crumbling. Trump didn't protect the Gulf states. He didn't protect Qatar, even though they gave him a plane. And now Trump's just upset that the plane isn't ready in time. It wasn't ready in time to fly him back from NATO, to the point where he's now going after New York Times journalists because of reporting on that. Can you take us through why the plane matters in the strategic sense, but also why there's been such a kerfuffle about the security around that plane?
Well, Air Force One is a flying fortress. It's got a huge array of inbuilt protective systems, including the ability to fire missiles out of the aircraft at anything that's attacking it. So it's a highly sophisticated transport platform because it's also able to conduct air warfare from that platform. Now, my understanding is, and this is what the journalists have told us, so I've got no further information beyond what is out there in public. My understanding is that in refitting the aircraft to a standard of superlative luxury, the like of which the world has never seen, Emma, in the words of President Trump, they weren't, in the time available to them, able to install the suite of defensive systems that they need to ensure that the president is not shot down. And given where he is at the moment, given his total lack of popularity everywhere except parts of the United States, and given that he's coming out of Ankara and flying over some of the most strategically disturbed parts of the world, I think the United States government had no option but to change planes. So they put him back onto Air Force One, where he probably should have been, and off he goes, leaving his new Taj Mahal. And given the way in which we started this program, Emma, we've got to remember that the Taj Mahal is actually a mausoleum. He's left his flying beauty parlour behind him and he's back on Air Force One. So I think the issue here is that Trump's hubris went far beyond the standards of security normally directed towards POTUS, and enough was enough. Somebody had to talk to him very firmly saying, well, it's all very well for you to think that you can be a martyr, but the United States can't afford it. You're going back on Air Force One. And that's what happened.
And it is funny given that he's so, presumably at the moment he is focused on his own mortality. He made a lot of those apparent threats on his life coming out of Iran, and we'll get to the death of Lindsey Graham and the disappearance of Mitch McConnell. But mortality is clearly on his mind. But he seems to be focusing that ire on the journalists who broke that story, which is a normal thing to happen in a democracy.
Yes, well, it's very hard to see where that particular subpoena or where those subpoenas are going to go. My own expectation is the courts will bounce them, but that won't stop the Department of Justice from mounting a massive and probably quite complicated case where sort of the freedom of speech amendment to the US Constitution, they will try to trump, if I may use the word, with the security of President Trump. And we'll see where that goes. But I think the federal court at least will say, no, it doesn't work like that. But we'll have to wait and see, Emma. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing that the president's doing, though, because he is actually interfering with one of the fundamental protections in the United States democratic system, which is the ability of the press, in particular, to hold government to account. So it's not just for the Senate and the Congress, it's for the press. And that goes right back to the writings of Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and everybody else in the Federalist Papers. So, Trump's he doesn't mind playing with fire. He probably doesn't even see that he is playing with fire. But I suspect here the courts will take a more restricted view.
But I guess, as you say, even if they do, and that I think you're right that that's the likely outcome, this still has a chilling effect. That's why Trump does it. He does it to intimidate people out of that kind of reporting, because court cases are expensive and scary, and it will make people with less power than New York Times journalists think twice, and these are people who are already thinking twice because of the environment that they're in. Trump is very good at that. He's done that for his whole career, used litigation to silence people even when he knows he can't win. It's a tried and true tactic for that president. And to kind of force a segue, that's why he's attracted to leaders like the Turkish president Erdogan, who he met at the NATO summit in Ankara last week. It was kind of notable that he was chummier with Erdogan than any of his European so-called allies, who he not subtly described as pathetic and weak in comparison to Erdogan. But despite all that, the NATO summit was almost really hailed as a success in a lot of the mainstream media coverage, because there wasn't a huge blow-up. What did you make of that NATO summit, Allan?
Well, I think it was a success because it didn't fail. And that's the worst reason for calling anything a success. Yeah. But it could have got worse. But I think what's happening in NATO, and we might put Mark Rutte to one side, but I think what's happening in NATO is that the reality test has hit them and they're understanding what they've got to do. And that is, they've got to be much more collegiate amongst themselves and look significantly less to the United States for leadership and looked for participative leadership within the boundaries of the European members of NATO. For reasons that you and I have been talking for over a year now, because we're going to publish on this in 3 months' time, participative leadership is one of the tools that will take us off into the future, where no one country will be calling the shots, but we'll be selling good ideas to each other and sharing both the execution of those good ideas and the benefits, one hopes, that one accrues. So I think what we're seeing in NATO is a change in the way in which they're thinking about themselves and a change in their own internal engineering, which is not one of dependency on the United States, but more or less, look, you can be a member if you like. We'd like to have you here because you're rich. But if you want to wind back your involvement, well, that's for you to decide. We'll get on with the business of maintaining a collective security in Europe. I think that's where they're headed.
They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. They fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
you have to use strong. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
Mark, you sit next to Donald Trump in moments where he talks about conquering Greenland, talks about lashing out at allies like Spain, starting trade wars, things that it doesn't seem like the old Mark Rutte would approve of. Does this have any effect on your self-respect when you sit next to him like that and say nothing?
What I always do is acknowledge when praise is due, and I think we should praise Donald Trump for the fact that NATO is so much stronger.
Mark Rutte is trying to play the middle there, and I think it's a difficult game for him to play because he's left in the same position as the head of FIFA, quite frankly. He just is a sycophant and says silly things to make Trump feel good through flattery. And I think that's demeaning of the Secretary General. I think he doesn't have to be rude, but he doesn't have to say what he's saying. And it would be better for the leadership, the senior leadership of NATO, if the Secretary General were just a little bit more discreet and a little bit more adult, in my view.
Rutte, I think, is, you're right, certainly being exposed, Alan, and that would be my reading, I think, of how things are in Europe as well, that Rutte is doing that thing, almost providing cover as European leaders get on, exactly as you described, with that approach of participative leadership, where they, are acknowledging what Trump is doing and moving on, taking the opportunity, we might even say, Alan.
Yes. Well, if that is a deliberate strategy on Rutte's part, that's good. It doesn't look too deliberate to me. But
no, I don't think it's deliberate. I think he's being used. Yeah.
If it is, it's a defensible position. But you've got to be so careful when you do use the sycophancy route, because it's hard to recover from it.
I don't think Rutte will be able to recover. Another person who has chosen that route is Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who is an all-in Trump sycophant. And according to a pretty extraordinary, even by Trump standards, fairly extraordinary story in the New York Times this week, is, as described by friend of the show, Professor Elizabeth Saunders, effectively acting as the viceroy of Venezuela. So according to this story, Rubio is effectively controlling Venezuela's revenue and dishing it out through private banks and basically dictating how it is spent. The leader of Venezuela is also apparently completely deferring to Trump, to the point where she's being asked to do an interview on Fox News and responding that she has to check with Trump first before she does an interview, which is quite an extraordinary situation. Alan, what is the broader context here of how the United States is treating Venezuela and the kind of damage that it is doing to that country?
In a way, Emma, the United States seems incapable at the moment of recognising strategic opportunity. And I think partly it is the reliance on militarism as its principal sort of tool for the management of international relationships. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. It probably goes back historically to the exercise of American exceptionalism, back in the beginning of the 19th century, when many of its current problems in Central and South America actually started up. The heavy hand of US sort of gunboat diplomacy and suppression of opposition. So Venezuela, I think, particularly after the earthquakes, it's both a catastrophe and a tragedy all at once, particularly for the people of Venezuela, and that's more or less where I would want to start. The massive strategic opportunity for the United States after the earthquake was to get in there quickly, dispatch a couple of the airborne divisions. I don't care how many they dispatched. They could have got a lot of people and a lot of material down there very quickly and started the work of rescue where they could, because it's a highly complicated rescue operation. But then after 2 or 3 weeks have gone by and nobody else is surviving, the removal of the debris and the beginnings of rehousing, 100,000 people. And the rest of South America would look on and say, well, at least somebody is capable of showing a bit of gumption here. But the United States has totally missed that opportunity. You've got people from all around the rest of the world doing the best they can in very small groups, trying to collaborate, but you've still got people with bare hands, no gloves, lifting huge bits of masonry out of the way while they still try to find another corpse. And that's a tragedy which the United States has allowed to happen. And while all of that's going on, the oil revenues are being split, one understands, 50-50. The United States taking half, the other half maybe going to wherever the United States permits it to go in Venezuela. So Venezuela has effectively had a 50% cut in its national budget at a time when it needs money desperately just to recover from a couple of earthquakes. So I think what we're looking at is a United States which seems incapable of seeing strategic opportunity, and underneath that can't display any of the compassion that the United States traditionally has been able to display. And I just think that it's an impossible position for the United States to be in, and very hard to recover from, because it set precedents which are very difficult, I think, to reverse. And Marco Rubio has sat on top of those precedents. So, to describe him as a sycophant is one word. He's a sycophant to Trump. But also, for all of his professed religiosity and beliefs and so on, he does not translate those into action. So sycophancy and hypocrisy do seem to go incredibly well together.
They do. And by all reports, they will likely go together in Cuba as well, if Rubio continues to get his way. To go back to our starting theme, Allan, one of the key reasons that the United States cannot identify those opportunities, as you just described, one of the reasons it cannot find compassion or empathy in its foreign policy was Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who, as Obituaries described it today as we're recording, advocated for a quote-unquote muscular US foreign policy, which is a revolting way of describing policy. But that was Lindsey Graham.
What is your reaction to hearing what Donald Trump says?
Disgusted. He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. He doesn't represent my party. He doesn't represent the values that the men and women who wear the uniform are fighting for.
I want to start with a bunch of thank yous. I want to thank the big guy, God. Trump comes later. Mr. President, you're not far behind God, but we're going to start with him.
I think his finest moment was his defense of Brett Kavanaugh, who's a terrific guy, and was treated very, very unfairly by the Democrats, very unfair. I've never seen anything like it. Maybe the worst I've ever seen anyone treated. That includes me. Well, maybe not me.
In Israel, it's grief. In Iran, it's celebration, because Lindsey never confused good and evil.
Do you think it means anything, Allan, that Lindsey Graham has died? Does it have implications for the Senate or for US foreign policy?
I think the short answer, Emma, is no. I think there are so many sycophants and yes men around Trump at the moment. There is clearly somebody who can say no to Trump, but basing no on Trump's own sense of his own mortality and vulnerability. So somebody won on Air Force One. But that's the only bit of opposition to Trump that I've seen in the whole of this presidency, actually, to have come to any sort of fruition that differs from Trump's own instincts. So there we had, I think, Lindsey Graham was a very strange person, very enigmatic to me, because I can't see how somebody could come through the life that he came through. He brought up his sister effectively on an Air Force salary, for God's sake. He has been sort of a self-described patriot for most of his career, called the Air Force, the body that was really responsible for the formation of his character, had a long friendship with John McCain, and then suddenly goes from being a very strong and informed critic of Trump to being just a total acolyte, totally absorbed and owned by Trump, except with a little bit of sensitivity towards the Ukraine, but within the boundary of keeping the Ukrainians, standing on neither foot, keeping them unsettled, with Trump booting them all the time, but Lindsey Graham saying, well, just keep praying. It might work for you. It doesn't work for me because I don't believe it anymore, but it might work for you. And a very odd sort of position for him to be in. And I know that, of the dead, one should never speak ill. But I think for Lindsey Graham, there was nothing good that you could say about him now, and nothing good you could say about him last week. He's one of these people who'll disappear very quickly from history, and we'll wonder how he was able to go from being the person he once was to the person he became. I find it inexplicable, but that clearly is a massive weakness of mine, Emma.
Or a strength, Alan, depending on how you look at it. Yes, I mean, I think it's a reminder to live your life in a way that Itamar Ben-Gvir doesn't describe you as one of his greatest friends when you die.
Yep.
Alan, we are almost out of time, but in the interest of fully traversing the globe, which we have almost done actually in this episode, I wanted to finish by asking you about the Pacific, because Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been in the Pacific making some new deals, and you wrote about that in The Point last week. So I just wanted to ask you about how you see the Albanese government's, I guess, evolving Pacific diplomacy.
I'm finding it sort of tricky to read that, Emma. You and I have been talking for a couple of years now about the massive opportunity that faces Australia with the arrival of the second Trump presidency. And everybody rightly looks at the dangers of the Trump presidency, and we should certainly take account of those and tread carefully. But with every sort of massive change like that, there comes enormous opportunity, because disruption creates opportunity. And I think at last we're seeing some of that opportunity being harvested by the Albanese government, at least in the Pacific. The focus on the security agreements is understandable in current circumstances for two reasons. One, we haven't come to terms with the fact that China is the dominant power in the Pacific, as well as it is the dominant power in Asia. And so the foreign minister used the word instability, that the firing of the missile, fortuitously, I think, when I say fortuitously, I'm using that classical sense of it was just an act of luck that they happened to be on the same day as Albanese signed the agreement with Rambuka. But we haven't come to terms with that, and we think that if the Chinese do something which you'd expect great powers to do, then that's creating further instability. Well, really, the moment of instability passed some very considerable time ago. What we've got to understand is that China is doing what China does, and we've got to work out, well, if what China's doing is demonstrating to everybody that it's got very considerable military power, that it can now fire submarine-launched ballistic missiles over very long distances, 5,000 kilometres, maybe more than that, then what's available to us? I mean, if China's going to leverage its military power and its money, because every time it seems to use its military power, it likes to sweeten the deal a bit by providing somebody with a sporting pavilion or something like that. What have we got? And I think the answer to that, and this is what Albanese and Penny Wong and Pat Conroy are all showing, the answers to that is we've got a lot. We've got a huge amount. We've got some tools that we can use in our soft policy kit bag that is simply not available to China, which is so often ham-fisted in the way in which it conducts itself in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. So what we've got is sport, religion, which seems a bit odd, but the South Pacific countries are pretty religious, and they like coming to Australia to do their training for their ministers. We have a labour market which we need people to come in. So we've got a whole set of tools. We don't find Pacific people standing in queues wanting to go to China. That's understandable. Their experience of China has not been a particularly happy one. So we have a set of foreign policy assets that China hasn't got, and we see the government now beginning to use them. And that is where I take a lot of comfort from. And more than that, we have the beginning of some indications that a suggestion which is being pushed by Prime Minister Wale from the Solomon Islands, that is that we might consider a sort of a more broadly based collective security agreement across the Pacific, is coming from a Pacific Island country and not being forced down their throats by New Zealand or Australia. And I think the fact that we're learning how to respond to those opportunities and to think about, back to our theme, Emma, participative leadership is a really good sign in the conduct of our relationships in the Pacific. So I think we're moving away from sentimentalism like, our Pacific family and getting on with things which are a bit more real, like our shared interests, the things that we have in common, the fact that we've had long relationships, some of them not so good, but some of them quite good, and that we're beginning to see and to respect the nature of Pacific cultures across the board. I think that that's a very, very good set of signs. And so where China wants to come in all the time and parade around in big black cars, men wearing suits and looking very powerful, we're slowly learning how to sit in the sand, shut up and listen. And I think that's a pretty interesting change in direction. So I think that's exactly what Australian governments should have been doing for quite a long time.
Mm. Well, Allan, I think it's very impressive that given the way I started this show, we've managed to end on somewhat of an optimistic note. So well done, you. I should just mention, because you brought up labour mobility, Allan, that our colleague Morgan Harrington has done a podcast series on Pacific labour mobility and specifically the PALM visa scheme and some of the pretty significant problems with that scheme, but also how it can be improved to genuinely benefit Pacifica peoples. We'll link that in the show notes. Allan, thank you so much, as always, for coming on the show and for managing, as always, to find some optimism amongst all that death and destruction that we had to talk about.
As they always say at Undertakers conventions, Emma, there's always tomorrow.
Thank you so much for joining us. We will be back with another episode, as usual, next week. If you'd like to get in contact about the show today or at any time, you can reach us at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 13th of July. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.